All right, verse 19.
So, welcome back. I hope you all are doing well. Romans 12, just finishing up the chapter today, starting in verse 19. Remember that Paul has been calling us all to kind of a moment of community here, how we interact with others in the community. And then I think we end, there's a sense in which we end by looking outside of the community. Not that these words couldn't apply within as well, but I think there is a sense in which these words point us outside of just the church. So let's jump in here, verse 19. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Let's stop there, Michael. So we saw this, we've seen this, don't return bad for bad, don't curse those who curse you, bless them instead. This is woven throughout the New Testament, it's deeply entrenched in the gospel, and we see it here as well. Don't avenge yourself. Don't lash out on others. Let God be at work for you. Quoting an Old Testament passage here, and there's a sense in which if there's punishment to be made, trust God for that, and you set this other standard of returning good for bad instead. Not hard to interpret. I think most of this 12th chapter is not hard to understand. Not easy to do when you have been on the wrong end of being wronged.
Yeah, and this is connected to verse 18, obviously, where we're told to live peaceably with all. And on one hand, that's an easy thing to say. I think today we see the implication of that writ much more clearly. This idea that living peaceably means that we don't get to settle scores. We don't get to choose what justice is for another person. And that is the really interesting flip side of grace. We have an intern here at the church, and when we do that, we'll read books together and study them. And one of them was a book on grace. What was the exact title of that?
What's so amazing?
What's so amazing about grace, right? And in that, he recounts a story about the scandal of grace and how the reality is grace, when we receive it, is a great gift, and we're grateful for it. When we see other people receiving grace that we don't think is deserved, that's when the struggle becomes real as people of faith to accept what God is able to do in the lives of others. And here, this idea of taking vengeance, of pursuing justice to our own end, that becomes very, very hard to do when we see others receiving the same grace that we've received. And on some deep level, that is in itself to trust God to do good for ourselves and then to trust God to do good for others. That is, in some ways, some of the most difficult practices of the faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you just watch children. When we have an instinctive nature when hit or hurt to lash back, to return that, and to try to leave room for God to be at work in those relational moments is a struggle. In fact, this is, we'll read through this and we can see that it's maybe even a struggle for Paul. Verse 20, no, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So the line in here that has always kind of made scholars scratch their head is, by doing so, you heap burning coals on their heads. And it is easy to read this and say that Paul is being manipulative here. What Paul is saying is you get the best, you quote unquote win. But I think the idea here is that you force them to re-examine themselves. When they give you bad, expecting bad in return, and you overcome evil with good, it shames them. It should make them reconsider, and it gets rid of the possibility that they can then justify their behavior by pointing at yours. Because if you act like a jerk because they have, then they say, oh yeah, I knew Clint was a jerk. if you respond with kindness and grace, then you've heaped coals on there. So this can be read as petty, and many have read it that way, and some have suggested that that's how Paul means it, that maybe Paul can't quite live up to his own advice. I think that's a stretch. I think it's much more likely that he's saying they should be ashamed when they see how much better you handle this than they do. But there is, just to let you know, there is a lot of discussion about how this verse gets in there and what it might mean.
Yeah, so you have this idea that we leave room for the wrath of God in verse 19. And now we have this question that's raised in verse 20. Is this its own form of wrath being described? That in doing this good to someone who's expecting you to return evil, is there its own kind of wrath wrapped up in that? And once again, I think that's fascinating that human readers immediately turn to that to say, is this an out? Right. Can I get in here? Because ultimately, it is instinctive. I mean, whether it's children or whether, quite frankly, it's just reading the newspaper. You see one person write one thing one week, and then the next you read someone else is responding vitriolically the next. I mean, it's just humans. We have this sense, if you do something, I'm going to do something that's in equal or greater measure. And ultimately, this idea of, well, can I find a way to heap wrath is not the right way to read this. I think ultimately the idea is that vengeance is the Lord. Providence is the lens by which Christians say God will do as God seeks to do. And we've seen over and over, Clint, this refrain that Paul brings, that God is righteous, that God alone is just, which means that Paul's conviction is that God will do right by every creature that God makes. We can trust God to do that. So when we hear this language about humans sort of heaping coals, I think that's far more a reflection of maybe a byproduct of what we do, as opposed to some ultimate statement. In other words, there is a sense in which when we do the right thing in the face of opposition, in the face of evil, there's a sense in which God gets glory for that. And the one who's pursuing ill means, they're shown in that moment for what they are, for the ends that they're seeking. There is a kind of, you use the word shame, maybe it's shame, maybe it's just, quite frankly, there's a truth-telling that happens in that moment. And, as Christians, we would root that in God's grace and action in us. We wouldn't say that that was something that was done because we were good or we were righteous or because we get it right all the time, but rather because as we seek to love others in the grace that has been given to us, that will naturally reveal the motives, the intent of those who wish harm and are going down a different road.
Yeah, it's very easy to get lost on verse 20, but I think it's worth remembering that Paul ends with 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is clearly the takeaway in this passage. This is clearly what Paul intends and the bar that Paul sets for Christian behavior. And so while verse 20 may be interesting and even perhaps troubling, I think when you remember that it's surrounded by verse 19, never avenge yourself, and verse 21, overcome evil with good, it would be very hard to somehow think that this one phrase gives us permission to do exactly the opposite of what everything else has been calling us to do. And so while it's interesting, I don't think you should read it as permissive.
This is, quite frankly, a tough day, not intellectually. This isn't hard to understand what Paul's calling us to be as people. But if we are able to slow down for a moment to consider that Paul may be talking to us, that Paul is saying that this is a metric of the Christian life, that we should examine ourselves based upon how well we do overcoming the evil that surrounds us with good, I can't imagine there's anyone with us in the conversation today who, if we're being honest, wouldn't admit that this is unbelievably difficult. I mean, the sheer presence of evil in our life, regardless of how large or small we might describe it of being, is an unbelievably challenging experience for most of us. When we're surrounded by people who we know said, maybe you hear someone said something behind your back, or maybe you experienced some kind of social isolation, or you felt made fun of. These are small things compared to the glaring sort of evils in the world that surround us, that we know are in our culture and in our world, right? And when we come face to face with these things, it is unbelievably challenging to meet that evil with good, with light, with something constructive that's rooted in the hope of Jesus Christ. And so this is one of those, Clint, where this is much less about, hey, can we exegete the text? Do we understand what Paul meant? This is, how do we practice this in such a way that hopefully someday this is reflected by our behavior? And as someone who hopes that that's true for me, I can tell you that these are some very, very difficult words.
I think in many ways we assume that the measuring stick of the gospel is how we treat those we love and those we care about. But really, I think we're much closer to the heart of it here when we talk about the struggle to extend kindness to those who are unkind to us, the struggle to bite back curses of those who curse us. I mean, this is the paradigm of what Jesus did. This is the enactment of what Jesus did in going to the cross, that he gave himself. He blessed those who cursed him. He gave himself to those who hated him. And I think, that makes this central to the gospel, and also makes it, I think, one of the most difficult callings we have as people of faith, because when we have been hurt, it is 100% natural and understandable to want to hurt in return, and to learn by following Christ, to learn slowly and repeatedly to get bad but give good, and to overcome evil with good is, I think, a monumentally difficult task, one that I think we're never done with, one that I think will, for most of us, always continue to be a struggle.
Yeah, and I think we all can relate to this personally, Clint, that we have people who we struggle to have relationship with. We might not call them an enemy, though maybe we would, but there are people who we know treating well, loving. That seems beyond our ability today to do. But in the passage tomorrow, when we turn to chapter 13, we're also going to discover that Paul has, I think, in mind more than just those personal relationships. He does have in mind some of the systems and structures and governing authorities, even the people who are given the task of ruling and seeking to maintain order. You got to remember that the Roman church is in a very, very tenuous situation between persecution and sort of this very... I'm trying to come up with a good word. The Roman government at this point there's some scholarly debate about whether it's open searching for Christians or whether this is just sort of a tenuous moment. But what we know is that to be Christian in Rome was not to receive any social benefit. It wasn't good news for you that you were a Christian in Rome, and it was only going to get worse as persecution became codified, as it became law. And so for Paul to be talking about overcoming evil with good, and then in the verse tomorrow where we're going to talk about how we are to behave towards governing authorities, I think it just throws in even into sharper relief. There are just sometimes the deck is literally stacked against you, and the expectation is, as a Christian, that we will respond with the goodness of Christ, even in those circumstances. Even as Christ sat upon Pilate's throne, and from that throne was raised up on the cross, we are called in whatever circumstance we find ourselves to find good. It just gets even more difficult as you consider it from that lens.
There's a great deal in the New Testament that is political in its implication. I think tomorrow we see one of the few verses that is political in its subject matter. There aren't too many places in the New Testament when the idea of systemic politics and faith interact. And what Paul does with that is very interesting. So if I tell you we're going to talk, church and politics tomorrow, that may not sound exciting, but I do think it leads to a very interesting conversation. So I hope you'll be able to join us.
Thanks for being with us today, friends. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.